Hello and welcome to Agency Office Hours for August 2022. I'm Karl Sakas, agency consultant, coach, and trainer, helping people who run agencies make smarter decisions for smoother growth. Here's a preview of the topics we will be covering today here in Agency Office Hours from Sakas & Company. First up, Michelle in Jacksonville, Florida, has a question about working with employees, specifically how do you encourage employees to do professional development? Then we have a question from Justin in British Columbia. He's at the point where his agency is splitting account management and project management. Always a good place to be as you grow. Question is, what's the best way to do it? We'll talk about that. Then we have a conversation with Jon Morris from today's sponsor, Ramsay Innovations, talking about resource planning. Specifically, how can your agency use resource planning to boost employee retention, client retention, and profit margins? And finally, we have a question from Natalie in Massachusetts around what's going on with hiring right now. Amidst all of the economic uncertainty, what are people doing? So that's the plan for today. If you'd like to ask a question in the future, please include it when you RSVP. My colleague Kate has shared links to all of the upcoming events. It's always the second Tuesday of the month in this time slot, 12 Eastern time, New York City time. And if you pre-register, you'll get the recording as well. As a reminder, we are recording, so don't share anything out loud. You don't want to be recorded. And if you don't want your full name recorded and you're joining live, go ahead and update it in Zoom to shorten it if you like. All right. Well, first up is Michelle. Michelle, if you want to unmute yourself and come on camera, thank you for joining Office Hours today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So to paraphrase, the question you asked is this: how can I incentivize my employees to do professional development? If you could elaborate a bit on the question and situation, and we'll dig in on answering it.
Sure. So I regularly read books, that are on marketing and business topics, and would like to encourage my team to do the same, not just skill development, but really kind of building a higher level advanced marketing strategy knowledge base. I've always done it through reading, and just kind of want to figure out a way to incentivize the entire team to do those sorts of things, even when they're all very, very busy. We're all kind of at our max capacity. Yeah. So just wanting to think about find out ways to do that.
There are a few things to look at, and to frame things, how big is your agency currently?
We're 10 people.
10 people. Got it. And the advice I'll share will apply for everyone listening, regardless of agency size, but we'll dig in on a few specific things. Okay, so when we think about employee professional development and how to encourage people to do it, there are several points to consider. First, people have to want to do it. No matter what incentives we create, it does come down to hiring people in the first place who want to develop professionally. You could have all the incentives in the world, and if someone just doesn't value it, they're probably not going to do it, or they'll kind of phone it in. So that's a key starting point. I actually do this in my hiring process, and I do this with clients when I'm helping them with their hiring process, their agency. One of the questions in the application process, whether it's upfront or it's like a fast follow application, is to ask, what do you do for professional development? People can say, what are the websites they follow? Are there some podcasts? Are there some trainings they do? Things like that. The exact answer almost doesn't matter. The main thing is that they put something. And this is intentionally, I would recommend, as an optional question. So people could leave it blank. The thing is, our industry is changing so rapidly. You probably don't want to hire, or even interview someone who doesn't seem to do anything on ProfDev. Michelle, does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Then the next point to consider is how can you connect professional development in terms of new skills and broader skills and things like that. Ideally, link that to their promotion path and their professional growth plan. And by the way, at your current headcount, it is totally normal not to have formal promotion paths, things like that, but it probably makes sense to start thinking about it. So if you don't have it now, totally fine, but you'll be ahead of others when you start thinking about it. And by the way, anyone who's listening, if you've got 15, 20 people plus, and you don't have a professional development growth plan for your team, do it now. You don't have to say it out loud. So, what does that involve? Well, actually, Kate, if you don't mind joining, we talked to, Kate, my operations manager, joined a little bit under a year ago. And one of the things we talked about in the hiring process was, kind of path. So, Kate, what do you recall about how we approached that, both during the hiring process and since then?
Yeah, so Karl created this FAQ document for people who were interested in the position. And it said kind of what his expected projection of the role would be. And then when I got the position, Karl does O3s, one-on-ones, weekly, 30 minutes, where whatever I want to talk about for 10, whatever he wants to talk about. And then we talk about professional development. What am I interested in taking on? What am I interested in learning? And he recommends courses that I can go to or events that I can attend. And I can bring, hey, I saw this book. I think it's really great. Can I purchase it for my professional development? And so I think having the trajectory in mind and identifying the professional development that can help me get there faster was really, really helpful.
And of course, it helps, Michelle, that Kate is highly motivated, that's important. But the fact that we're talking about professional development in some form every week just makes it part of the cadence. And I use the manager tools O3 one-on-one format, where it's 30 minutes every week. It's 10 minutes about whatever the employee wants to talk about, 10 minutes about what you want to talk about, and 10 minutes at the end about planning for the future, which is usually professional development kind of stuff. So the key thing there, and it's okay, thank you for sharing that, appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
So Michelle, the key thing there is that if people want to get promoted, you can tie the professional development work to their promotion goals. The one case where it can get sticky is if someone's professional development interests aren't related to what the agency needs. For instance, a client years ago had someone who really wanted to get into information security, but that had nothing to do with what the agency was doing or needed or what have you. So in that case, they needed to do it on their own. Kind of deal. But what are some things that you're seeing the team do for professional development now?
They all do HubSpot certifications, and we do ask them to do that when they join. We send everyone a book right when they join the agency. Everybody writes because we just kind of want to set an expectation for how we do writing, because we're a heavy writing agency content. And then and that's really the extent, to be honest. I have not developed a more formal program, and I'm loving some people put some ideas in the chat that were some great ones as well, and mentioned some of the certifications.
Which, by the way, all the more reason if you're listening to the recording, join live and you'll get all of the resources as well. So actually, thanks for everyone who's sharing in chat. I see Molly, for instance, you mentioned you have once a month professional development days where the team is unavailable for calls, meeting, Slack, so on. So you can dedicate time to immerse yourselves in books, webinars, podcasts, clarity breaks, courses, museums, etc., without feeling tied to your computer. And thinking about it, once a month, like that is not terrible in terms of the impact on client availability. You can plan to check things like next week I'm doing a 3-day team retreat with my team. I will be checking if a text comes in, if a client needs emergency support, can help them out, things like that. And then Jon, I see, and we'll talk more soon, before you started Ramsay, you built and then sold Rise agency. You had a certification program. I see you mentioned chat as a requirement. Within the first 3 months, employees need to get at least one of the Google certifications, and by the end of the year, they needed 4. I love that ramp-up structure, and that fits into, I think Kate shared my article about creating a new hire ramp-up plan, where, what do you need from people week 1, month 1, 2, 3, so on. So that makes sense. So, it helps, Michelle, that you're a role model to your team. Like, they can see that you're doing professional development. It would be a lot harder if it were like, team, do this, but you don't do it yourself, kind of thing. So that definitely helps. I also would include industry-related publications. And there's a trade publication for everything. At one point, when I had a client, I was director of client services at an agency. I was a cosmetic dentist. So for instance, I subscribed to the Dental Economics newsletter. It was like advice on the business of running a dental practice. There's also Pizza Today, right? If you work with restaurants and pizza places in particular, like there's something for everyone. And that may be a case where, Michelle, you don't need a subscription for every single person, but at least kind of keep up there. With all of this in mind, as we shift over to Justin in just a moment, what are your thoughts, Michelle, on next steps for you?
I'm going to read all the articles that you have put in this chat. And then my initial idea was to start what I call the agency book club as a starter. And I would pick the book each quarter. I guess the only question I had with that would be, one, everyone is completely slammed right now. So,
right.
How do I set that expectation about, is this a during work hours, not work hours thing? And then really kind of what my thought was that everyone has to write maybe a lessons learned blog post from the book or something, some way to kind of have some deliverable output from that was my initial idea. But I still want to kind of do some thinking and looking at the ideas here. So, and I love the point. I love that question for hiring. I'm going to definitely implement that.
Nice. And definitely for everyone listening, please consider stealing the idea. Again, it's an optional question in your hiring process. What do you do for professional development? Mm-hmm. To Michelle, to your question about some of the cadence bit on the book and otherwise, and how to fit it in, it probably makes sense to get your team's feedback on what they would feel comfortable committing to. Mm-hmm. For instance, it might not be, or there's some agencies that do like a book a month. That's fairly aggressive. Quarterly is an option. It also might be a case, I like the idea of having some sort of a book report kind of sharing. One option, though, might be, maybe one person per book is in charge of the blog post kind of thing, or maybe one person writes an extended post, or maybe everyone shares like a paragraph of takeaways or something, so that it's not falling on everyone to write a full deal. But this, by the way, is something to consider for everyone on your team. I had a client that had a department director who left, and there were 2 internal candidates who were interested in the role. They decided not to hire publicly. They knew that one of the internal people would be a good match. The challenge is, one was qualified, likely a match. The other thought he was qualified, but probably wasn't. And so the agency owner was like, what do I do? My advice was this: assign both of them to read my pocket guide, Made to Lead, a pocket guide to managing marketing and creative teams, and have them come back with a book report. What stood out from the book? What do they see their strengths and weaknesses as a manager would be? And just sort of see how they approach the assignment. One person came back with this in-depth review, really good understanding, he was thinking it all through. The other person got the book and decided, like within the first few pages, they liked the idea of being a director and they liked the compensation of being a director. They had no interest in doing the job. So he opted out, and it worked out. So Michelle, good luck as you work through things, and let me know how it all goes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, up next is Justin. Justin, if you want to unmute yourself and come on camera, let's answer your question around agency roles. Thanks for joining today, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to paraphrase, your question is this: how should we approach splitting account management and project management responsibilities as we start dividing the AM and PM roles? If you could elaborate a bit on what you're dealing with, and we'll dig in on an answer.
Yeah, so we're a small creative company specializing in video production. And we started out, I think, as a lot of people do, as a group of creative subject matter experts, and then realized that there was a need for our services and started to form a business out of it. Over the last 10 years, we've ranged from 4 to 6 people, including the 3 owners, which makes us a bit of a unique format. And it's had a lot of people wearing a lot of hats.
Yes.
And that has resulted in a pretty high baseline of chaos over the years, as everyone is doing all of the different roles. And so our new goal as a team is to grow and to calm some of that chaos. And a part of that has been to establish some clear roles. And the concept of swim lanes has been helpful. None of us, however, have experience in a formal agency setting. And so the concept of an agency model has been very helpful. Specifically, the account manager role is the one that has been least defined and probably our biggest area of weakness, unsurprisingly. And so as we have started to define some of those roles, I've taken on the account manager role. I previously have been doing the project manager as well. And the concept of the strain of those 2 roles being held by the same person has resonated. And so we've started to introduce the idea that we're going to separate these roles, but particularly without that agency experience and being new in this account manager position. The thing that I'm most curious about is the lines of communication with our clients, and how strict is that account manager, particularly with a precedent of open communication where everyone's sort of communicating with everyone. Right. How do we adapt that, and what kind of guidelines or best practices would you recommend?
A lot of pieces going on. Let's dig into the key chunks. So ultimately, when it comes to splitting account management and project management for the first time, here's some things to keep in mind. First, celebrate that you're doing it. You know, a lot of agencies combine the role where someone's doing account management and project management. Maybe they're doing subject matter expert work, maybe they're doing client strategy, maybe they're doing everything else. It's tough to do all of it. And you mentioned that in the past, you've done both account management and project management. That's a tough combo to do for anyone, but you're in a unique spot as one of the owners. For instance, I recently recommended that a client hire a project manager at his agency. And you know, there's a bit of like, well, what would they do? What's the point of having a PM? And his comment was, you know, at one point he was doing PM and he was managing all of these accounts and he was doing some of the work and this and that earlier in his career. He did acknowledge there were, you know, things that slipped through the cracks at doing that. But I also noted, like, agency owners tend to be kind of superhuman at the work they're doing. Like, there's a reason that he is now running an agency, not serving as like director of accounts at an agency where he's not the owner, right? His goal was to keep moving up, moving up, moving up. So, you know, first, congrats on splitting them. The next thing to consider is, what is the point of account management? What's the point of project management? Account management, and Kate has shared my article on the 6 agency roles, is basically keep your clients happy and usually sell them more work. They're about building a relationship with the client and being the voice of the client within the agency, and in part selling them more work. Project management is more about getting work done smoothly, profitably, and on time. And it's more about what is concrete rather than what's possible. And the challenge that agencies run into, if you've got one person doing both, they're supposed to manage the details and what is definite, and also think of new things to sell the client, but also make sure, that you're getting paid for it. So ideally, it's two separate people. To your question, thinking just in terms of the fuzziness around the role, one thing to consider based on your current headcount would be if the account manager is also responsible for some degree of client strategy. And the way I define client strategy is basically how can you maximize the ROI of the client's budget, or maybe optimize, right? It's not unlimited potential return, but based on the client's budget, what's the best way to use it? Combining client strategist and account manager, whether their title is strategist or account manager, can be a good combination. If ideally there's a separate project manager who's helping the account manager stay on track. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
The related piece, you mentioned that before it was a bit of a free-for-all where clients would reach out to anyone and everyone and this and that. That will require some retraining of existing clients. So like if you've got a new client, the new client, so if you or one of the other owners are doing in the sales process, ideally you're introducing the client to their new account manager before the deal closes. Probably not on the first call or even the second call, but certainly once you've got a proposal, either before you send the proposal or when you're doing the Q&A call about the proposal, ideally the client is meeting the account manager so that they can get to know them. They're like, oh, they are a likable person, the account manager, and they know what they're doing and they're, up to date on what's going on, kind of thing. That transition is important. Ideally, don't wait until the kickoff meeting to be like, all right, we've had all of these discussions. Here's the new person. They know nothing about what we've talked about before. Have fun. I'm never going to see you again as the salesperson. That's not a good situation, though a lot of agencies do it. And by the way, if anyone's listening and that's how you do it, okay, but you can change for the future. So when it comes to new clients, the key is to introduce them to the account manager toward the end of the sales process before it officially closes. And that's part of why account managers, if someone's a pure account manager, is only going to be about 50 to 60% billable because they're doing sales support and upsells and stuff like that. Now, what about your existing clients? That can be a bit harder, right? If they're used to going to you all the time, they like that, right? And so part of the retraining process is to help clients see that it's in their interest to go to the account manager first. One transition that I'll recommend for a lot of agencies is someone else is the account manager, and then you as the owner continue as the client strategist, but you get pulled in as needed rather than being on necessarily every single call. Does that make sense, Justin?
Yeah, I think so.
And some of that does require some, client retraining. For instance, at one of my roles as an agency employee was as a project manager, but I was also serving as an account manager, even though that was, a PM title. Part of my job was to insulate our strategists from the clients. So for instance, we had a client who worked at an industrial services firm. I actually saw one of their trucks earlier today on the highway. I won't mention their name, but he loved speaking with the strategist assigned to his account. She was less thrilled about speaking with him. He was kind of needy. Like if I didn't answer the phone, if I was in a meeting or something, I would start hearing him call all of the extensions in the office because he needed to talk to someone. He really needed an account manager. So, one day I actually got a call and the strategist was out and I had said, oh, she's out, but actually I've worked on this issue before, and I talked him through what to do. And his response was, I'm surprised you knew how to do that. I guess as a project manager, he had slotted me into a certain cubby hole or something like that. So the key thing, though, is that ultimately you want the account manager to be there between you and the client, if that's how you choose to do it. The alternative is to keep everything merged, but then you run into the problems that you've experienced. So From what we've shared so far, before we shift into speaking with Jon, Justin, what would you say are your next steps or takeaways from here?
I think clarifying the expectations and having creating consistency. I think first of all within the team, so that there's clear expectations on everyone, and then moving to clearly communicating that externally with our clients to kind of reset that pattern. I think would be the next step.
And it's going to take some time, and some clients may never want to go along with it. You may also find, and I mean, this is true for everyone listening, you may need to sometimes bite your tongue. Like you see a client reach out about something, you know the answer, but you've told the client, go to the account manager, maybe it's you write what the answer is, but the account manager sends it, right? So that the client sees the account manager as the answer person rather than you, which can be a hard adjustment, right, as a business owner. But to me, that's success when the client thinks the account manager should always be the first one to call.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for your time. Absolutely,
Justin, thanks. Let me know how it goes. So switching over to Jon Morris. So Jon, welcome back. If you unmute yourself, welcome back to the Sakas Company Agency Office Hours.
Thanks for having me back. Excited to be here.
So Jon, as we discussed, before starting Ramsay Innovations, and thank you for sponsoring today, which helps agencies with their finances, you founded and then sold an agency, Rise, which I think grew to 200 people. Is that right?
About 250 people,
250.
Managing about 250 million in media by the time we left.
So you have been there and you have done that.
I can speak very clearly from working from by myself out of my home to 250 people. After that, I might be over my skis.
That is okay. So, when we were talking about potential topics, you had mentioned resource planning, and I know you'll have a follow-up resource where people can dig in even more on this. In fact, later this week. But you raised the point that agencies want to boost their profit margins, increase employee retention, increase client retention, and just make things run more smoothly. And of course, there are a lot of ways to do that. But you pointed out that if you're good at resource planning and billable utilization, you can actually improve all of those. So what tips do you have? What should people be thinking about?
So the first thing I talk about is there are 3 truths to every single agency. Truth number 1 is that the clients want to pay you less, have you work more hours, and talk to more senior people.
Kind of the opposite of my upcoming book, Work Less, Earn More. They're like work more and pay less.
Exactly. And truth number 2 is that your employees want to work less and be paid more. And truth number 3 is people like me who help you with your finances require you to keep the exact same margin. So you have clients want to pay you less, have you work more hours, talk to more senior people, employees want to work less, get paid more, and someone in the middle is saying you got to make the same margin year in after year in. And resource planning is really one of the major keys to how you're able to do that. And
maybe first, how do you define resource planning?
So in my opinion, resource planning is a forward-looking tool, not a backward-looking tool, where you are ensuring that every single client for every single service that they have paid for gets the proper amount of resources so that you can do the jobs that they've hired you for without killing your team.
Makes sense.
And I can tell you, I'll speak ad nauseum. One of the things I'll talk about when it comes to resource planning is gross margin. And just real quickly, my definition of gross margin is when you take your net revenue. So media doesn't count, any pass-through technology doesn't count. It's your real revenue minus all of the expenses that are completely dedicated to client work. So the account managers, the project managers, the client strategists, the paid search experts, or whoever they are, Those are all your costs of service. And whatever you have left over is your gross margin. And my mentor is a guy named Jack Kraft, who's the former vice chairman and COO of Leo Burnett. And he used to explain that if your gross margin is too high, somebody is getting screwed. It's either your employees and you're killing them, or it's your clients and you're not delivering for them. And so you don't want to kill your employees, and you want to make sure that you deliver for your clients. The number one sales goal that I speak about regularly is never lose a client due to performance. The vast majority of the agencies have reoccurring or retained revenue. And if you can keep that revenue, you know, your business should grow. You should be able to add more clients. But if you lose that revenue, you have a leaky bucket, you're going to struggle. So,
and I hear that often where people are like, oh, you know, I need more leads, which, you know, may be true, but the more recurring revenue you have, the less pressure there is to constantly replace projects all the time.
Yep. And I'm a huge believer. I mean, one of the tricks to how Rise was able to scale was we probably invested more in sales and marketing than any other agency out there as a percentage of revenue. Like I was obsessed with 2 metrics or 3 metrics. One of them was gross margin. So I wanted as high gross margin as possible, once again, without killing a team and making sure that we deliver. And then the second thing was, as a percent of revenue, I wanted to invest as much in sales and marketing as I possibly could, which would help scale the growth of the business.
And as the financial expert for agencies, do you have a target range for gross margin?
So yes, 50%.
50%.
So, yep. And just to give you an idea, 2021, which is the only data I've aggregated so far, the clients that came to us, their gross margin was 40% before they started working with us. And, you know, within, you know, a period of time, we've gotten the average up to 48%. So, you know, and a lot of people have a really hard time figuring out how they can get to 50%, but it is very doable, and it will make your business incredibly profitable and allow you to invest back into the business to grow. But I'll give you some challenges that I hear regularly as it relates to resource planning.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorites. I just promised my client delivery team that I'm going to stop selling because we don't have the capacity to take on any more clients. So what that's telling me is that you haven't invested in your recruiting infrastructure. You haven't thought about your resource planning. You haven't figured out how you can hire. And the last thing I want you to do is slow down your sales engine. Because then what happens is you end up losing that big account and you're like, crap, why did I stop selling?
Yeah.
You know, and so you have to constantly be selling. But if you don't do resource planning, it becomes hard.
Yes.
Second one is I'm crushing the team. They're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And to me, you're not doing proper resource planning in terms of what do you charge? How much revenue do you target per employee? Making sure that you have, you know, the right amount of resources at the right amount of time. And then the third one is I don't know what my team is doing, but they're clearly not working very hard. And that one I hear less of. But what I can tell you is, you know, you generally can see it in the profit margin. I have clients that come to us where their profit margins are like 19 to 20%. That's because they've completely overstaffed the accounts, and, you know, they're not allocating the resources as effectively as they could. Trying to think of the last one would be, actually, this is one of my favorite stories.
Yeah.
When Rise was around 17 employees, I used to randomly call on employees and be like, so what clients are you working on? And tell me what you're doing for them. And what I learned being CEO of a company is that your employees love to tell you details. So they'll be like, I'm working on this client and I just did this really cool keyword research. And, you know, I did this and I did that. And I was like, awesome. I was like, what other clients you're on? I was like, oh, I'm on this client. I was like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I optimized them for this week. Well, optimization is code for they did nothing. And so what that told me was there could be a resource problem, you know, because once again, these clients paid us to do something, not to optimize as code for nothing, but to actually make sure we deliver for them.
So what can agencies do differently? You know, it sounds like there are a lot of potential obstacles. What should people do differently?
So the first thing really comes down to how you forecast and getting incredibly granular. Okay, you can't just forecast and say, I want to do, 5 million in revenue for the year. You have to get down to, this is how much revenue I want to do for every single service. This is how much revenue I want to do for every single client. And ideally, this is how much revenue I want to do by client, by service. So that is your starting point. I'll give you examples of things that I had to deal with that I'm sure every single person here is listening has had to deal with.
Yeah.
Area one is your revenue might be U-shaped. So it could be growing, but it's seasonal and you have major dips in your revenue. What do you do with your team during those dips? Other scenarios are clients shift their revenue. And so you have a bunch of, let's just say, media revenue, and all of a sudden you have less media revenue and more web development revenue.
Yes.
Third scenario, the easiest scenario is a ramp. Your revenue is constantly climbing, and it's climbing in the exact same way that you want it to climb with every single service. I find that very rare. Enjoyable when it
Usually
happens.
kind of lumpy, right? Some are up more, others might even be down, or
Exactly. So then the next thing you have to really understand is, once you have a good idea of your revenue broken out by service and broken out by clients, then you have to, just as you were talking about project management versus account management and what are the different roles and responsibilities, you have to really understand the roles and responsibilities for each one of those services and have targets amount of revenue for each one of your employees for that type of service. So I like to talk about web development quite a bit because it's a lot more complicated than media from a resource planning standpoint.
got it.
And here are the reasons why. The roles are, you'll have an account manager, you'll have a project manager, you'll have a designer or UX expert, you'll have an engineer, you might have a DevOps person, so you have all these different roles.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out, as your revenue scales, what is your target for each individual and how you allocate the time and the resources. So that's the first thing, is really understanding the roles.
Okay.
The second thing you have to understand is seniority. So just because I mentioned, UX versus engineering versus account management versus project management,
Right.
vice presidents versus directors versus managers versus entry-level people also do different jobs.
Yes.
And what you're ultimately trying to do is create a hiring schedule. And you're also trying to determine, if revenue shifts, can you shift internal resources to those different areas, or do you have to hire externally? You have to determine if you're going to have to let people go, if the revenue drops. And then the last one, this is actually a big finding for me personally, and something that eased a lot of the stress on my team, was you have to predict turnover.
Yes.
Typically, agencies have 15 to 20% turnover that is natural. No matter what you do with employee engagement, no matter how wonderful of a place your business is to work, 15 to 20% of your company is going to leave. To give you an example, Rise in 2015 was recognized by Ad Age as one of the 50 best agencies. I don't know if it's in the country or in the world.
Yeah.
To work. Okay. We still,
like great recognition, but I'm guessing there was some turnover after that.
Yeah, there was still 15 to 20% turnover. So our morale was phenomenal. Like, the culture was amazing.
Yeah.
We received probably one of the most prestigious awards you could get from a best place to work standpoint.
Yeah.
We still have 15 to 20% turnover.
Yeah.
And so when you think about what happens when an employee leaves,
Yes.
the client work doesn't stop, but the amount of capacity you have has decreased.
Yes.
It puts a burden on the entire team. And so what we started to do was we hired 26 people a year, assuming 26 people a year were going to leave Rise. And
So basically, you knew there was going to be the attrition, so you hired so that it would be a net zero,
It
net
was-
neutral, and then
it wasn't totally net neutral in the sense that, like, you still have to onboard a new employee, you still have to train them, you still have to get them up to speed.
right.
At least it shortened the pain to getting everyone up to speed at a much faster rate. And just so you know, the way we came up with 26 is we hired 4 people in January and then 2 in every other month. And the reason why is, we learned that January was our highest turnover month. And the reason why, in my theory,
Mhm.
is that it's kind of New Year's resolutions. People are reflecting on their life and they're saying, is this
Right.
what I want to be doing? And we had people leave for all sorts of reasons. We had people leave for competitors, shame on them. And then we had, like one person went to be a track coach at a university,
Yeah.
so
Like kind of pursuing their passion outside of the agency world.
Yep.
So, we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we can't. But for people who are listening live, my colleague Kate has shared some links in chat about hiring the cheapest competent available person, about always be recruiting, and more. But Jon, I know you have an event in your line item series coming up later this week where you'll dive even deeper. And Kate has shared a link in chat. Could you share more about who's a good match to attend that, to register and attend?
I mean, look, any agency owner really of any size has to deal with resource planning. We go into all the different elements of forecasting, identifying your resources, allocating those resources, and really getting into the reporting and insights that you need on a regular basis to think about. We also go into how do you structure your data? And that's honestly the most important part. Is the more granular you can get with your data, the more insight you're going to be able to create. So I think it's going to provide a lot of valuable content. At least I hope it does, because that's why I'm doing it. And I really appreciated this opportunity to kind of talk to you a little bit about resource planning.
Absolutely. Well, Jon, thank you for joining. For everyone who's listening, whether live or otherwise, I had attended an earlier line items event, tons of great advice. And if you can't make the next one, or you're listening to the recording and you've missed it, I know, Jon, you and your team are doing a series of line items events. So I guess if people happen to miss this next one, like sign up for it, they can go to ramsayinnovations.com to hear about the latest. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. In September, for example, we're talking about building a standardized org structure to scale your business. So, every month we have a different topic that really helps you run your agency in a more effective way.
Nice. Well, Jon, thanks so much for joining and for sponsoring today, and people check out the event.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well, we have one more question for today. And specifically, this is looking at what is going on in hiring right now. We have economic uncertainty. What is going on? So the question specifically is from Natalie in Massachusetts. She had a conflict that popped up, so she wasn't able to join us in person, but let's answer the question anyway. And by the way, if you're on live, please share in chat. How are you approaching hiring right now? So to paraphrase, Natalie's question was this. In terms of hiring trends, what are agencies doing right now in hiring new employees? Are people cutting back on FTE hires due to the economic uncertainty? Or, what else is going on? Ultimately, it's unique for each agency, but across the agencies I work with as an agency consultant, people are still hiring. If you have work to do and you need to staff things, and to Jon's point earlier about if your team is overworked, right, you need to fix that. People are absolutely hiring right now, but they're also being intentional about it. For instance, does it make sense to hire a full-time employee, or potentially could a part-time contractor do it, kind of thing? And it's always a balancing act. For instance, if you have a contractor that's working 15 to 20 hours a week and you're paying them on an hourly or retainer basis, you're probably paying them almost as much as you would pay a full-time employee. Kind of depends on your benefits and things like that, but you're usually paying about twice per hour to a contractor as you would for an employee. So if you're on that cusp of 15 to 20 or more, probably makes sense to hire someone as an employee. That also helps you avoid potential compliance issues around worker classification as well. So people are hiring, they're being more intentional about it. Keep in mind, what is the market like from a candidate perspective? We're in a situation, I saw this described, and Kate, if you can find, I think there's at least some articles on this, the idea of bleach collar workers. So think of the idea of, white collar workers. The term bleach collar worker is basically looking at white collar workers who have high compensation and the ability to write their own ticket about their work conditions. For instance, they want to work remotely, they will dictate to the company that they will work remotely. And this tends to be tech-oriented roles, thinking as an employee at agencies, we had developers over a decade ago who were working remotely. This was before remote work was as broad, but if you're a developer and you're good at your job, you can define the terms, and how you work, things like that. So, keep in mind, some of it will vary by role. Competitively, as some companies start bringing people back in to work, if you have people working remotely or if you have a hybrid structure, that can be a recruiting strength. And it is worth looking at what your recruiting strengths are in general. If you join live, my colleague Kate has shared links in chat, my article about small agency recruiting strengths. You may be competing with candidates who are much larger companies or considering roles at larger companies. Be careful about trying to compete on price, in the sense that if someone is looking to join a really large tech firm, the really large tech firm is going to give more money. A story I've shared before, a client was hiring for a manager level role, someone who was at one of the FANG companies, and it said, they weren't happy, they didn't like it there. They're making $110,000 a year. The agency offered them a small bump. They accepted the job, and before the start date, they backed out. They said the company countered with an extra $100,000. So they went from $110,000 to $210,000 for what was not a $210,000 job at the agency. And so, the person backed out, didn't join. Be careful about competing with people who are at really big companies that are expecting really high compensation. So consider, is it a full-time role, or would part-time or a part-time contractor make sense? I'm curious for people who are on live, what are you seeing in your hiring? What are you noticing right now? It certainly varies by geographic market. It varies by services. Like John, we were talking about, say, web development versus other services, kind of thing. It also comes down to what are your values as an agency owner or leader. For instance, when the COVID pandemic started in 2020, many of my clients saw their pipeline dry up or at least stop, right? They may have had prospects, but the prospects were like, well, we're not sure about now, we need more time, this and that. And one of my clients in particular, we were talking in like May of 2020, he's like, things have dried up. Do I need to do layoffs? And we talked through things, and he had significant cash reserves. And we were talking through pieces, and I said, you could plan to do layoffs now or in the near future. Ideally go for one bigger layoff rather than a series of smaller ones. But you do have unusually high reserves. You have the option to sort of weather things if you want, but I don't recommend planning to keep everyone forever, regardless of what happens to your revenue. So ultimately what he decided on was he would give it 3 months. He would basically subsidize compensation for up to 3 months. And if things hadn't turned around, he would then prepare to do layoffs in month 4. And good news, 2.5 months in, things turned around for him, and revenue was coming back in again from new clients beyond existing clients, and he didn't do the layoff. But a month after that, his best employee resigned. And in our next coaching call, his comment was like, if I knew she was going to leave, I wouldn't have done that. The thing is, he had followed his values. His values were he wanted to keep the team together if he could for up to 3 months as an investment. So my advice to you is consider how are your reserves and how much are you willing to invest in the event of a downturn, whether globally as is evolving, or for your agency specifically. The key thing is being intentional about it, right? Make a plan, follow your values, act accordingly. And that can include, for instance, making what we could think of as a layoff list, who would be first to get laid off and who would be last to get laid off, kind of bucket, bucket your team members. I had a former boss, it turns out, who every quarter updated her layoff list. Like, regardless of how the agency was doing, she had a quarterly layoff list. That might be a bit aggressive, but you never know. You never know. And Jon, thank you for sharing in chat. You mentioned people should know their monthly overhead, and ideally build a minimum of 2 months as cash reserve. Great point there. Personally, I like to be more aggressive on the reserve, but it really comes down to, what are your circumstances? For instance, kind of depends on what your overhead looks like, and also, what your personal finances are too. A key caution for everyone is you have the option of sacrificing your personal finances. Just be careful not to over-sacrifice personally, because you do need to take care of yourself and your family. For just about everyone I work with as an independent agency owner or a leader at an independent agency, the agency is their number 1 or number 2 financial asset. Right? Like, what else in your portfolio is producing 6 figures in annual income, plus, distributions from, from profits, and potentially could sell for $1 million or multi-million-dollar payday if your goal is to run an exit-oriented agency. Probably nothing else in your portfolio. The one exception might be if you're one of, say, 3 partners. It may not be your biggest asset, but it's probably up there near the top, number 1, number 2. So think through what to do first, and ideally also try to, if possible, look at cutting things that are invisible to your team rather than that are visible. For instance, several years ago, a client in Canada, I was reviewing their annual budget before the coming year. And I noticed that they had a line item. This is the first time I had reviewed the budget since working with them. They had done the budget before we started. I noticed that they had a line item in their budget for snacks, office snacks. They were spending $5,000 a year on office snacks. And I noted that was an unusual line item to have in their annual budget. And my client's reaction was like, Karl, we like our snacks. The thing is, based on their team size and this and that, they were only spending like $35 per month per employee on the snacks. They had about a dozen people at the time. And you know what? That $34 a month paid off. in ways that some of their other expenses that were invisible to people from a morale perspective may not. The key thing ultimately is be intentional. And Jon, as you added thinking 2 to 6 months ideally, and that'll depend on client concentration, recurring versus other revenue, partner buyout situation, capital investments, pipeline strength. And yes, good framing. If someone's like, I don't have 2 months, as you said, almost all the clients that come to Ramsay don't, and it can take 12 to 18 months to build it up. So for anyone who's listening live or recorded, you're like, you're not there yet. Now, like that joke about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. Today is the day. Well, on that note, that concludes agency office hours for August of 2022. Thank you so much for joining live or watching the recording here. We get together every second Tuesday of the month, sharing advice to help you grow your agency more smoothly, help you make smarter decisions for smoother growth. I'm Karl Sakas here at Sakas & Company. Thank you and good luck. See you next time.